Hello, everyone, and we are back to another edition of Conversations with Hutch Extra. Now, in the first one, you probably remember that I talked about the fact that I was born and raised in the Boogie Down Bronx. Yes. And yes, I could just say the Bronx, but when I say Boogie Down, that puts it in a capsule of time. It also emphasizes that it is the home of hip hop and all that comes with it. And I've been hearing hip hop since 1974, to put it in a reference point. Now, yes, there's a lot about hip hop that has some issues, but that's for another thread and another segment. But one of the things that I didn't say in that first extra is that I am a proud resident of Memphis, Tennessee. Yes, I am. Proud resident of this city in the Soulsville community, and I pastor in Frazier. So I'm glad to be a part of Memphis. Met some of the greatest people that I'll ever know here in Memphis. And so I'm honored to be here. But now, let me kind of give you a unique Memphis love story. It's not a typical love story, but I want to give you a snapshot of what Memphis is about. And I'm going to do so by talking about two preachers. Yes, Reverend Gentry and Reverend Clay. Some of you who are going to watch this remember both of these brothers, Reverend Gentry and Reverend Clay. Now, I want to give you some of their characteristics until I get to the real point of this story. First of all, they both loved preaching. Matter of fact, if you were a pastor like me and they showed up at your revival when you had an out of town preacher or even an in town preacher, that was like the good housekeeping seal of approval that you had something going on for them to show up. And they ran together, Gentry and Clay. Now, they were at the ministers' meeting every Tuesday. You'd see them around town. I don't think either of them drove. They rode the bus. And you who are in Memphis know we don't have the best transportation system as it involves our public buses. So they were riding the bus. And a lot of times, those of us who are riding, we'd see them at the bus stop. It'd be hot, see them walking and holler out, roll the window down, tell them get in the car and take them to where they had to go. They were beloved. But now let me describe these two brothers. First of all, Gentry had a shriveled up arm. Can't remember which one it was, and want to say it was his left one. He had a shriveled up arm, and he kind of walked with a slight limp and dragged his foot a little bit. That was Gentry. Clay was mush mouth, and then sometimes he'd be a little disheveled, and he was kind of slew footed. So both of these brothers had impediments, but they were fast friends, and they were loved by a whole lot of people, both clergy and lay persons alike. They were loved, loved, loved. Here's where the story shows off Memphis. Now, already, I kind of give you some inkling as to how people felt about them, because I put them in my car. Matter of fact, I had some conversation with Gentry about preaching. He found out that I came out of Concord in Brooklyn. And he was like, "Oh, did you meet Gardner Taylor?" And he got all into that. And he talked about some of his favorite sermons. And I believe one time when I went back home, I got him some sermons. And he was ecstatic. And Clay was the same way. So anyway, one of Memphis's greatest icons, Dr. Benjamin Lawson Hooks, passed away. Many of you have heard the name, know the person. He was over the NAACP for a season and also at the same time pastored two churches, one in Detroit and one here in Memphis. He was a native Memphian. He grew up in the Foot Homes housing projects that was really right across the street from where I used to pastor. Matter of fact, he came out of First Baptist Lauderdale, where I was pastoring for about 22 years. Ben Hooks passed away. And of course, the church where he pastored and retired from Greater Middle Baptist was not big enough to hold the funeral. So they held the funeral at Bountiful Blessings Church of God in Christ, where the late Bishop G.E. Patterson pastored. At the time, I believe G.E. was still very much alive. And so that's one of the largest churches in our city, very well equipped. So they had the services there. They told many of us who were clergy, me included, they said, you might want to try to get there early. So I believe the funeral started at 10 o'clock. They told us to be there at 9:30. They had a section for us, and we were able to sit there. And I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, I was sitting with the pastor emeritus of Metropolitan, Dr. Reginald Porter, and some other clergy. I knew clergy from all over the city were there. People from all over the world were there. Now watch what happens next. Funeral starts. Family walks in. Family seated. There's a long procession of people with them. Then finally, the well-known funeral home comes up and they get ready to close the casket. They had already stopped people from coming in behind the family. I was in a position where I was sitting to the to the left of the choir stand. So I was able to look out. They were stopping people from coming down that main aisle. And then Reverend Clay shows up. Reverend Clay, in his customary gait, walks in. Where they stopped other folk, he just kept walking. Nobody stopped him. Matter of fact, some of the funeral directors chuckled. And some of us on the choir stand were chuckling. We were watching this happen. And we said, oh, that's Clay. He's walking down the center aisle. Church packed. Dignitaries from all over the world. Clay walking down the middle aisle of the church. And a couple of folk hollered out to him. And he kind of nodded. And folk were just smiling. They weren't laughing. They were smiling because they would say, oh, that's Clay. He gets to the casket, glimpsed Dr. Hooks, turned, nodded to the family. I believe Sister Hooks, Sister Frances Hooks probably knew him because everybody knew him. Let me put it this way. It was to the point that our last two black mayors, Mayor Harrington, would say, Clay, how you doing? A.C. Wharton did him the same way. Everybody knew Clay. Clay turns, nods at the family, keeps walking. Nobody stops him. Everybody having the same reaction. Oh, that's Clay. They got a smile on their face. Clay comes in, and by that time, I think Gentry had passed away. And that's the only reason they weren't together. Because if they were together, same thing would have happened. They'd have walked down that middle aisle, and they'd have walked around. So now he passes the family, and he goes and sits at the end of the VIP section. There was still about 2 vacant pews. He went and sat at the far end. Nobody bothered him. Nobody moved him. Folk were smiling, and they were saying, that's Clay. No further fuss about it. And so let me help you translate what happened. Clay was not a dignitary. He was a salt of the earth person. Don't think he ever pastored. And both he and Gentry, they were decent preachers. I heard them preach. Good people. And I already told you about the impediments. But here's the bottom line. And I've seen this in Memphis with famous icons all the way down to regular people. When you're a part of the family, when you're a Memphian, people embrace you. Some people get embraced just in their neighborhood. Some people get embraced across the city. But this is a place that is really, even though it's one of the largest metropolitan areas in America, In some ways, it has the feel of a small town where you talk about 5 degrees of separation, we probably have 2.5 here. Everybody knows everybody else, and you get embraced, and people find ways, especially old school, because this may have happened maybe over 10 years ago. They find a way to embrace you and to let you know that you're a part of the family. So when they let Clay do that, even though this was really a worldwide funeral, matter of fact, all of the local television stations stopped their programming and ran this funeral live. And in the midst of all that, Clay just walked down the aisle and goes and takes a seat. And it's not a big deal. There's not a fuss. And people were smiling about it. We embrace people here. Now, we don't do it as often as we used to. And that's because the world is changing. But this is the type of place where you will see famous people just moving about the city and nobody bothers them. Why? Because they're family. I'll give you another example. Everybody in Memphis I know has a picture that they took with Penny Hardaway. And he just moves about the city. People don't flock him. Yes, they'll go up to him, maybe occasionally ask for autograph, but he's family. Here's part of my point in telling this story. We get caught up in the notoriety of people. We get upset about how celebrities get done, how basketball players get done, how people treat them. But you ought to be concerned about your family, your kinfolk, the people you love, the people you have connection to, and learn how to make and keep those connections. That's why I like this place, because people have a tendency to remember connections, and they show love in unusual ways. I've sat in restaurants and all of a sudden somebody said, "Sir, your tab has been paid." And when I look around and see who did it, person gone. I've been other places where folk have just been a blessing. Now, granted, I've been a blessing to people as well. So I don't want you to think this is one-sided, but this is a city that knows how to embrace its own. And so I wish some of that flavor would emanate in other places. You saw when young Dolph got murdered, you saw how the city was in mourning. People still in mourning over a year later. It's not accidental. We take pride in each other. And when one succeeds, our chests get puffed out because we all succeed. Don't you want to be like that with your family? Don't you want to be like that with your friends? Just don't look at people because of their status, but embrace the folk around you. That's what I saw this city do, especially in the Baptist world with Reverend Gentry and Reverend Clay. And those of you who are in Memphis, especially if you're out of the Baptist church, if you don't know who they are, just ask your pastor, ask somebody, especially if you're from South Memphis. And I'm sure somebody remembers those two guys because they were a fiction. I forgot to tell you, Reverend Gentry was a recording secretary for the Baptist ministers meeting that meets on Tuesdays on Macklemore. And he had impeccable handwriting. It was much better than mine. Embrace people. People are not throwaways, but find ways to embrace people and show them love. That's all I have. Keep watching, subscribe, and thank you very much. God bless you.